important things. She nodded to a wide-eyed young man with a dark scarf wrapped around his head, and he recoiled as though she had glared. Fool peasant. It was grating to think that only a few miles away that young chit Elaine sat snug and warm in the comfort of the royal palace, attended by scores of well-trained servants, and likely without two thoughts in her head beyond what to wear tonight at a supper prepared by the palace cooks. Rumor had the girl with child.
Give me 1 second, everyone. Let me change my light real quick.
It might be so. Elaine had never possessed any more sense of decency than her mother. Dylan was the brain there, a sharp mind and dangerous notwithstanding her pathetic lack of ambition, perhaps advised by an Aes Sedai. There must be at least one real Aes Sedai among all those absurd rumors. So many fabulations drifted out of the city that telling reality from nonsense became difficult. Sea folk making holes in the air, absolute drivel. Yet the White Tower clearly had an interest in putting one of its own on the throne. How could it not? Even so, Tar Valon seemed to be pragmatic when it came to these matters. History clearly showed that whoever reached the Lion Throne would soon find that she was the one the Tower actually had favored all along. The Aes Sedai would not lose their connection to Andor through a lack of nimbleness, particularly not with the Tower itself, Riven. Elenia was as certain of that as she was of her own name. In fact, if half what she heard of the Tower's situation was true, the next Queen of Andor might find herself able to demand whatever she wanted in return for keeping that connection intact. In any event, no one was going to rest the rose crown on her head before summer at the earliest, and a great deal could change before then. A very great deal. She was making her second round of the camp when the sight of another small mounted party ahead of her, picking its slow way between the scattered campfires in the last light, made her scowl and draw rein sharply. The women were cloaked and deeply hooded, one in strong blue silk lined with black fur, the other in plain gray wool, but the silver triple keys worked large on the four armsmen's cloaks named them clearly enough. She could think of any number of people she would rather encounter than Nay and Aron. In any case, while Aramilla had not precisely forbidden them to meet without her, Elenia heard her teeth grind as much as felt them, and forced her face smooth. For the moment it seemed wisest not to press matters, especially when there seemed no possible advantage to such a meeting. Unfortunately, Nayan saw her before she could turn aside. The woman spoke hastily to her escort, and, while armsmen and maid were still bowing in their saddles, spurred toward Elenia at a pace that sent clods of slush flying from her black gelding's hooves. The light burned the fool. On the other hand, whatever was goading Nayan to recklessness might be valuable to know, and dangerous not to. It might, but finding out presented its own dangers. "Stay here, and remember that you've seen nothing," Elenia snapped at her own meager retinue, and dug her heels into Dawn Wind's flanks without waiting for any reply. She had no need for elaborate bows and courtesies every time she turned around, not beyond what seemliness demanded, and her people knew better than to do anything other than what she commanded. It was everyone else she had to worry about, burn them all. As the long-legged bay sprang forward, she lost her grip on her cloak, and it streamed behind her like the crimson banner of Sarand. She refused to gather the cloak under control, flailing around in front of farmers and the light alone knew who, so the wind razored through her riding dress, another reason for irritation. Nayan at least had the sense to slow and meet her little more than halfway, beside a pair of heavily laden carts with their empty shafts lying in the muck. The nearest fire was almost 20 paces away, and the nearest tents farther, their entry flaps laced tight against the cold. The men at the fire were intent on the big iron pot steaming over the flames, and if the stench from it was enough to make Elenia want to empty her stomach, at least the wind that carried the stink would keep stray words from their ears. But they had better be important words. With a face as pale as ivory in its frame of black fur, Nayan might have been called beautiful by some, despite more than a hint of harshness around her mouth, and eyes as cold as blue ice. Straight-backed and outwardly quite calm, she seemed untouched by events. Her breath, making a white mist, was steady and even. "Do you know where we are sleeping tonight, Elenia?" she said coolly. Elenia made no effort at all to stop from glaring. "Is that what you want?" Risking Aramilla's displeasure for a brainless question. The thought of risking Aramilla's displeasure, the thought that Aramilla's displeasure was something she needed to avoid, made her snarl. "You know as much as I, Nayan." Tugging at her reins, she was already turning her mount away when Nayan spoke again, with just a hint of heat. "Don't play the simpleton with me, Elenia. And don't tell me you aren't as ready as I am to chew off your own foot to escape this trap. Now, can we at least pretend to civility?" Elenia kept Dawn Wind half turned away from the other woman and looked at her sideways, past the fur-trimmed edge of her hood. That way she could keep an eye on the men crowding around the nearest fire, too. No house badges displayed there. They could belong to anyone. Now and then one fellow or another, shielding bare hands in his armpits, glanced toward the two ladies on horseback, but their real interest was on shuffling near enough the fire to get warm. That, and how long it was going to take for the beef to boil down to something approaching mush. That sort seemed able to eat anything. "Do you think you can escape?" she asked quietly. Civility was all very well, but not at the expense of remaining here for all to see any longer than absolutely necessary. If Nayan saw a way out...
It's,
how?
Crossroads of Twilight.
The pledge you signed to support Marn has been posted across half of Andor
continuation
by now.
of,
Besides, you can hardly think
the Wheel
Aramilla
of
will
Time
just allow you
series.
to ride away.
It's,
Nayan flinched, and Elena could not help a tight smile.
book
The
10.
woman was not so untouched as she feigned. She still managed to keep her voice level, though.
How's your night
"I
going,
saw Jared yesterday,
D-Man?
Elenia, and even at a distance he looked like a thundercloud, galloping fit to break his mount's neck and his own. If I know your husband, he's already planning a way to cut you out of this. He would spit in the Dark One's eye for you." That was true, he would. "I'm sure you can see it would be best if I were part of those plans. My husband signed the same pledge.
Yeah, I won't be able to do my,
and he is an honorable man. He was too
my
honorable
diamond
for
art
his own good,
streaming
simple
for a
fact.
little bit,
But what Elenia
scratching with
wanted had
D-Man.
been his guide since before their
I'm
wedding
a little
vows.
disappointed in that.
Jared had signed the pledge because she wrote and told him to. Not that she had any choice, as matters were, and he would even repudiate it, however reluctantly, if she were mad enough to ask it. Of course, there was the difficulty in letting him know what she did want at the moment. Aramilla was very careful not to let
Yeah, I can't do mine,
She had everything in hand, as far as she could in the
I
circumstance.
can't do mine right now.
But she needed
My,
to let Jared know, if only
my
to stop him
webcam I was
from
using,
cutting her a way out.
it
Spit in
died
the
on me.
Dark One's eye. He could take them
So
both
I
to
gotta
ruin in the belief he was helping her,
wait
and he
till I'm
might
able
do
to,
it, even knowing it meant their ruination.
get another webcam to be able to
It required a great effort not
stream
to
my,
allow frustration and
redo my
fury suddenly
diamond art.
welling up inside her to show on her face, but she covered the strain with a
some,
smile.
yeah.
She took considerable
I'm still
pride in
doing
being
my,
able to
my
produce a
diamond
smile
art. I
for any
just
situation.
can't stream it now.
This one held a touch of surprise and a touch of disdain.
Yeah,
I'm not
that's like
planning
that's
anything, Nayan.
well, it was my
Neither
last
is
stream I
Jared,
did of
I'm
my
sure.
diamond art.
But if I were,
Cause I
what
did
would I
it,
include
then
you?
I was doing my little
Because
break
if I'm
I
not
do to where I was
included in those
kicking back
plans,
and
Nayan said bluntly, Aramilla might learn of them. She may be a blind fool, but she'll see once she's told where to
hey
look.
Florida,
And
how
you
you
might
doing?
find yourself sharing a tent with your betrothed every night, not to mention protected by his armsmen. Elenia's smile melted, but her voice turned to ice, matching the frozen ball.
Yeah, but I was doing my last where I was
You want to be
resting.
careful what you say.
Well,
Or
taking a
Aramilla
break
may
and
ask
smoking,
her
I had it
town
sitting in
honor to
front of me.
play
I went
cat's
to
cradle with you again.
adjust my
In
webcam,
truth, I think I can
and
guarantee
then
as much.
it just stopped
It
working.
seemed
It died.
impossible that Nayan's face could grow any whiter, yet it did. She actually swayed in her saddle and caught
I
Elenia's
hope you're
arm
doing
as if to
good,
keep from
Florida
falling.
Ted.
A gust of wind flung
Time to
her
do a little
cloak
dab.
up, and she let it flail. Those once cold eyes were quite wide now, The woman made no effort to hide her fear.
Yeah, so now I gotta
Perhaps
try
it was
to
too far gone to be capable of hiding it.
figure out how to
Her voice
get another
came
webcam.
breathless and panicked. I know you and Jared are planning something, Elenia. I know it. Take me with you, and I will pledge a wrong to you as soon as I can be free of Aramilla. Oh, she was shaken.
About to fall asleep. Hell yeah. Florida
Do you
Ted.
want to draw more attention than you already have?
Definitely appreciate
Elenia
you stopping
snapped,
by.
pulling free of the other woman's grasp. Dawn Wind and the black gelding danced nervously, catching their riders' moods, and Elenia reined her bay hard to quiet him. Two of the men at the fire hurriedly put their heads down. No doubt they thought they saw two noble women arguing
but
in
hopefully
the
I'm
evening and wanted to
somehow
attract
able
no
to
part of that anger on themselves.
come up with
Yes,
the
it must be
funds
only
to
that. They might carry tales, but they knew better than to get
get
mixed in
another
their betters' arguments.
little webcam.
I have no plans.
I did buy
to
real
escape.
cheap webcams,
None
so
at
I guess
all,
that's
she
probably
said in
a
quieter voice.
part of the problem too.
Drawing her cloak close again, she calmly turned her head to check the carts and the nearest tents. If Nayan was frightened enough, when an opening presented itself, there was no one close enough to overhear, but she still kept her voice low. Matters might change, of course. Who can say? If they do, I make you this promise. Under the light and by my hope of rebirth, I will not leave without you. A startled hope bloomed on Nayan's face. Now to present the hook. If, that is, I have in my possession a letter written in your own hand, signed and sealed, in which you explicitly repudiate your support of Marn of your own free will, and swear the support of House
What
Saran
helps is,
to me for the throne.
well, my glasses are already like that.
Your hope of rebirth. Nothing less.
Try to get like a blue tint glasses.
Nayan's head jerked back, and she
like
touched
blue
her
lights
lips
for
with
like
her
TV
tongue.
screens and
Her
whatnot.
eyes shifted as though searching
And just have
for
it
a way
set
out.
a little bit low. That's how I do mine.
The black continued to snort and dance, but she barely tightened her reins enough to keep him from bolting, and even that seemed unconscious. Yes, she was frightened, but not too frightened to know what Elenia was demanding. The history of Andor contained too many examples for her not to know. 1,000 possibilities remained so long as nothing was in writing, but the mere existence of the matter would put a price on Nayan's teeth and the reins in Nayan's hands. Publication meant Nayan's destruction, unless Elenia was fool enough to admit to coercion. She could try to hang on after that revelation, yet even a house with many fewer antagonisms between its members than Iran, many fewer cousins and aunts and uncles ready to undercut one another in a heartbeat would still break apart. The lesser houses that had been tied to the for generations would seek protection elsewhere. In a matter of years, if not sooner, Nayan would be left as the high seat of a minor and discredited remnant. Oh yes, it had happened before. We've been together long enough. Elenia gathered her reins. I wouldn't want to set tongues wagging. Perhaps we will have another chance to speak alone before Aramilla takes the throne. What a vile thought. Perhaps. The other woman exhaled as if all of the breath in her body were leaking out, but Elenia went on, turning her horse away, neither slowly nor in haste, not stopping until Nayan said urgently, "Wait!" Looking back over her shoulder, she did just that. Waited, without speaking a word. What needed to be said had been said. All that remained was to see whether the woman was desperate enough to deliver herself into Elenia's hands. She should be. She had no Jared to work for her. In fact, anyone in Iran who suggested that Nayan needed rescuing likely would find herself imprisoned for thwarting Nayan's expressed will. Without Elenia, she could grow old in captivity. With the letter, though, her captivity would be of a different kind. With the letter, Elenia would be able to allow her every appearance of complete freedom. Apparently she was bright enough to see that. Or maybe just frightened enough of the Tarabonner. I will get it to you as soon as I can, she said at last, in a resigned voice. I look forward to seeing it, Elenia murmured, barely bothering to mask her satisfaction. But don't wait too long, she almost added, and just stopped herself. Nason might be beaten, but a beaten foe could still put a knife in your back if goaded too far. Besides which, she feared Nayan's threat as
Trying to
much
make
as
Mike
Nayan
laugh like
feared
he was on
hers,
face, huh?
perhaps more. So long
I
as
was
Nayan did not
preoccupied
combat, however, her blade had no
from
point.
coughing.
As she rode back to her armsman, Elenia's mood was more buoyant than it had been certainly since before her rescuers had turned out to be Aramilla's men. Perhaps since before Dylin had imprisoned her in Arengil in the first place, though she had never lost hope there. Her prison had been the governor's house, quite comfortable, even if she had to share an apartment with Nayan. Communicating with Jared certainly had presented no problem, and she thought she had made some inroads with the Queen's guards in Arengil. So many of them had been new come out of Chiron that they were unsure where their true loyalties lay. Now, this wonderfully fortuitous encounter with Nayan lifted her spirits so much that she smiled at Janny and promised her a bevy of new dresses once they were inside Camelin, which produced a properly grateful smile from the plump-cheeked woman. Elenia always bought new dresses for her maids when she felt particularly good, everyone fine enough for a successful merchant. It was one way to ensure loyalty and discretion, and for 20 years Janny had delivered both. The sun was only a red rim above the trees now, and it was time to find Aramilla so she could be told where she was sleeping tonight. The lights said it was a decent bed, in a warm tent that was not too smoky, with a decent meal beforehand. She could not ask more at present. Even that did not dent her mood, though. She not only nodded to the clusters of men and women they rode past, she smiled at them. She almost went so far as to wave. Matters were progressing better than they had in quite some time. Nayan was not simply disposed of as a rival for the throne. She had been leashed and brought to heel, or as good as.
How's everyone's
and that might
evening or day going?
be sufficient to bring Karen and Lear. And there were those who would accept anyone other than another Trakand on the throne. Elorian, for one. Morghese had had her flogged. Elorian would never stand for any Trakand. Aemlyn, Arathella, and Abella were possibilities too, with their own grievances that could be exploited. Perhaps Pelavar or Luan as well. She had her feelers out. And she would not squander the advantage of Camelin, as that hoyden Elaine had. Historically, holding Camelin was enough to gather the support of at least 4 or 5 houses by itself. The timing would be key, certainly, or all the advantage would fall to Aramilla. But Elenia could already see herself seated on the lion throne with the high seats needed for her fealty. She already had her list of which high seats would need to be replaced. No one who had opposed her was going to be allowed to cause her trouble later. A series of unfortunate accidents would see to that. A pity she could not choose their replacements, but accidents could happen with incredible frequency. Her happy contemplation was shattered by the scrawny man who suddenly came up beside her on a stocky gray, his eyes feverishly bright in the fading light. For some reason, Nason had sprigs of green fur stuck in his thin white hair. It made him look as if he had been climbing in a tree, and his red silk coat and cloak were so worked with brightly colored flowers they could have passed for Ilianer carpets. He was ludicrous. He was also high seat of the most powerful single house in Andor, and he was quite mad. "Elenia, my darling treasure," he brayed, spraying spittle. "How sweet the sight of you is to my eyes. You make honey seem stale and roses drab." Without need for conscious thought, she hastily reined Dawn Wind back and to the right, putting Janny's brown mare between her and him. "I'm not your betrothed, Nason," she snapped, seething at having to say that aloud for everyone to hear. "I am married, you old fool. Wait," she added, flinging up a hand. The imperative word and the gesture were for her armsmen, who had laid hands on sword hilts and were glaring at Nason. Some 30 or 40 men wearing House Cairn's sword and star were following the man, and they would not hesitate to cut down anyone they thought was threatening their high seat. Some already had blades half drawn. They would not harm her, of course. Nason would have them hanged to a man if she was even bruised. Might. She did not know whether to laugh or cry over that. "Are you still afraid of that young oaf Jared?" Nason demanded, angling his mount to follow her. "He has no right to keep bothering you. The better man won, and he should acknowledge it. I'll challenge him." One hand, plainly bony even in its tight red glove, fumbled at a sword he probably had not drawn in 20 years. "I will cut him down like a dog for frightening you." Elenia moved Dawn Wind deftly, so they described a circle around Janny, who murmured apologies to Nason and pretended to take her mare out of his way while getting in it. Mentally, Elenia added a little embroidery to the dresses she would buy. Addle-pated as he was, Nason could go in a blink from honeyed words of courtly love to groping at her as if she were the lowest sort of tavern maid. That she could not endure, not again, certainly not in public. Circling, she forced a worried smile onto her face, though in truth the smile took more effort than the worry. If this old fool forced Jared to kill him, it would ruin everything. "You know I could not abide to have men fight over me, Nason." Her voice was breathy and anxious, but she did not try to control it. Breathy and anxious suited well enough. How could I love a man with blood on his hands? The ridiculous man frowned down that long nose till she began to wonder whether she had gone too far. He was mad as a spring hare, but not in everything, not always. "I had not realized you were so sensitive," he said finally, without stopping his effort to ride around Janny. His decrepit face brightened. "But I should have known. I will remember from now on. Jared may live, so long as he doesn't pester you." Abruptly, he seemed to notice Janny for the first time, and with an irritated grimace, he raised his hand high, balling it into a fist. The plump woman visibly steeled herself for the blow without moving aside, and Elenia gritted her teeth. Silk embroidery. Definitely unsuitable for a maid, but Janny had earned it. "Lord Nason, I have been looking for you everywhere," a woman's simpering voice cried, and the circling stopped. Elenia exhaled in relief as Aramilla rode up in the twilight with her entourage, and had to stifle a surge of fury at feeling relief. In over-elaborately embroidered green silk, with lace under her chin and at her wrists, Aramilla was plump verging on stout, with a vacuous smile and brown eyes that were always wide with affected interest, even when there was nothing to be interested in. Lacking the brains to tell the difference, she possessed just enough cunning to know there were things that should interest her, and she did not want anyone to think she had missed them. The only real concern she had was her own comfort and the income to ensure it, and the only reason she wanted the throne was that the royal coffers could provide greater comfort than the revenues of any high seat. Her entourage was larger than Nason's, though only half were armsmen wearing the 4 moons of her house. For the most part, hangers-on and sycophants made up the rest. Lesser lords and ladies of minor houses, and others willing to lick Aramilla's wrist for a place near power. She did love people to fawn over her. Nayan was there, too, on the edge of the group with her armsmen and maid, apparently cool-eyed and in control of herself once more, but keeping well away from Jacques Lunault, a lean man with one of those farcical Tarabonner veils covering his huge mustaches, and a conical cap pushing the hood of his cloak to a ridiculous height. The fellow smiled too much as well. He hardly looked like a man who could reduce someone to begging with just a few chords. "Aramilla," Nason said in a confused tone, then frowned at his fist as if surprised to find it raised. Lowering his hand to the pommel of his saddle, he beamed a smile at the silly woman. "Aramilla, my dear," he said warmly. not with the sort of warmth he often directed at Elenia. Somehow it seemed he had become at least half convinced that Aramilla was his daughter, and his favorite at that. Once Elenia had heard him reminiscing at length with the woman about her mother, his last wife, dead nearly 30 years now. Aramilla managed to hold her end of the conversation too, though she had never met Midella Caerin as far as Elenia knew. Still, despite all his fatherly smiles for Aramilla, his eyes sought through the shadowed crowd on horseback behind her, and his face relaxed when he found Sylvaise, his granddaughter and heir, a sturdy, placid young woman who met his gaze, unsmiling, then pulled her dark fur-lined cowl well forward. She never smiled or frowned or showed any emotion at all that Elenia had ever detected, just kept an unvarying cow-like expression. Plainly, she had a cow's wits, too. Aramilla kept Sylvaise closer than she did Elenia or Nayan, and so long as she did, there was no chance that Nason would be forced to retire from his honors. He was mad, assuredly, but sly. "I hope you're taking good care of my little Sylvaise, Aramilla," he murmured. "There are fortune hunters everywhere, and I want the darling girl kept safe." "Of course I am," Aramilla replied, brushing her overfed mare past Elenia without so much as a glance. Her tone was honey-sweet and sickeningly doting. "You know I'll keep her as safe as I keep myself." Smiling that empty-headed smile, she set about straightening Nason's cloak on his shoulders and smoothing it with the air of someone settling a shawl on a beloved invalid. "It's much too cold out for you. I know what you need. A warm tent and some hot spiced wine. I'll be happy to have my maid prepare it for you. Arlene, accompany Lord Nathan to his tent and fix him some good spiced wine." A slim woman in her entourage gave a violent twitch, then rode forward slowly, pushing back the hood of her plain blue cloak to reveal a pretty face and a tremulous smile. Suddenly all those lick-spittles and toad-eaters were adjusting their cloaks against the wind or snugging their gloves, looking anywhere except at Aramilla's maid. Especially the women. One of them could have been chosen as easily, and they knew it. Oddly, Sylvaise did not look away. It was impossible to see her face in the shadows of her hood, but the opening turned to follow the slender woman. Nason's grin showed his teeth, making him look even more like a goat than usual. Yes, mulled wine would be good. Arlene, is it? Come, Arlene, there's a good girl. Not too chill, are you?" The girl squeaked as he swept a corner of his cloak around her shoulders and gathered her so close she was leaning out of her saddle. "You'll be warm in my tent, I promise." Without so much as a glance back, he rode off at a walk, chortling and whispering at the young woman under his arm. His armsman followed with the creak of leather and the slow, wet clop of hooves in the muck. One of them laughed, as if another had said something funny. Elenia shook her head in disgust. Pushing a pretty woman in front of Nason to distract him was one thing. She did not even have to be that pretty. Any woman the old fool could corner was in danger. But using your own maid was revolting. Not as revolting as Nason himself, though. "You promised to keep him away from me, Aramilla," she said in a low, tight voice. That lecherous old crack brain might have forgotten her existence for the moment, but he would remember the next time he saw her. "You promised to keep him occupied." Aramilla's face grew sullen, and she petulantly tugged her riding gloves tighter. She had not gotten what she wanted. That was a great sin to her. "If you want to be safe from admirers, you ought to stay close to me instead of wandering about loose. Can I help it if you attract men? And I did rescue you. I haven't heard any thanks for that." Elenia's jaw clenched so hard that it began to ache. Pretending that she supported this woman of her own choice was enough to make her want to bite something. Her choices had been made clear enough. Write to Jared, or endure an extended honeymoon with her
a nice glove wax.
Light. She might have taken the choice, if not for the certainty that Nason would lock her up in some out-of-the-way manor, and after she had put up with his pawing, eventually forget she was there, and leave her there. Aramilla insisted on the pretense, though. She insisted on a great many things, some of them utterly insufferable. Yet they had to be suffered, for the time being. Perhaps, once matters were set straight, Master Lunald could offer his attentions to Aramilla for a few days. From somewhere she summoned an apologetic smile and made herself bend her neck as if she were one of the bootlicking leeches who were watching her avidly. After all, if she crawled for Aramilla, it only proved they were right, too. The feel of their eyes on her made her want to bathe. Doing this instead of Nayan made her want to shriek. I offer you all the gratitude that's in me, Aramilla. Well, that was no lie. All the gratitude that was in her came about equal to a desire to strangle the other woman very slowly. She had to inhale deeply before she could get the next part out, though. You must forgive me for being slow, please. A very bitter word. Nason made me quite distraught. You know how Jared would react if he learned of Nason's behavior. Her own voice took on a honed edge at that last, but the fool woman giggled. She giggled. Of course you're forgiven, Elenia, she laughed, her face lightening. All you need do is ask. Jared is a hothead, isn't he? You must write to him and tell him how content you are. You are content, aren't you? You can dictate to my secretary. I do hate staining my fingers with ink, don't you? Certainly I'm content, Aramilla. How could I not be? Smiling required no effort at all this time. The woman actually thought she was clever. Using Aramilla's secretary precluded any possibility of secret inks, but she could tell Jared quite openly to do absolutely nothing without her counsel, and the brainless fluff would think she was only obeying. Nodding with a smug self-satisfaction, Aramilla gathered her reins, imitated by her coterie. If she stuck a pot on her head and called it a hat, they would all wear pots, too. It is getting late, she said, and I want an early start in the morning. Adela Barron's cook has an excellent repast waiting on us. You and Nayan must ride with me, Elenia. She made it sound as though she were honoring them, and they had no choice except to behave as though she were, falling in on either side of her. And Sylvaise, of course. Come, Sylvaise. Nason's granddaughter brought her mare closer, but not up beside Aramilla. She followed a little behind, with Aramilla's sycophants crowding on her heels since they had not been invited to ride with Aramilla. Despite the fitful, icy wind tugging at their cloaks, several of the women and 2 or 3 of the men tried unsuccessfully to engage the girl in conversation. She seldom said 2 words together. Still, with no high seat in reach to fawn over, a high seat's heir would do, and maybe one of the fellows hoped to marry well. Likely 1 or 2 were more in the nature of guards, or at least spies, making sure she did not try to communicate with anyone in her house. This lot would find that exciting, touching on the edges of power. Elenia had her own plans for Sylvaise. Aramilla was another with no objections to nattering away when anyone with sense would be muffling herself in her cowl, and her chatter as they rode through the dying light flitted from what Lear's sister would offer at supper to the plans for her coronation. Elenia listened only enough to murmur approvingly at what seemed appropriate spots. If the fool wanted to offer a sworn amnesty to those who opposed her, far be it from Elenia Sarand to tell her she was a fool. It was painful enough having to simper at the woman without listening to her. Then one thing Aramilla said hit her ear like an awl. You and Nayan won't mind sharing a bed, will you? It seems we are short of decent tents here. She flitted on, but for a moment Elenia could not hear a word. She felt as though her skin had been stuffed with snow. Turning her head slightly, she met Nayan's shocked gaze. There was no possible way Aramilla could know about their chance meeting, not yet. And even if she did, why would she offer them a chance to plot together? A trap? Spies to listen to what they said? Nayan's maid? Or Janny? The world seemed to spin. Black and silver flecks floated in front of Elenia's eyes. She thought she was about to faint. Abruptly, she realized that Aramilla had addressed something to her directly and was waiting on an answer with an increasingly impatient scowl. Frantically, she cast her mind about. Yes, she had it. A gilded coach, Aramilla? What a ridiculous notion. As well ride in a tinker's wagon. Oh, delightful! You do have such marvelous ideas. Aramilla's pleased simper put a little ease into Elenia's breathing. The woman was a brainless fool. Maybe there was a shortage of suitable tents. More likely, she just thought they were safe now, tamed. Elenia turned her bared teeth into a simper of her own. But she put aside any idea of having the Tarraboner entertain the woman, even for an hour. With Jared's signature on that pledge, there was only one way to clear her path to the throne. Everything was in hand and ready to go forward. The only question was whether Aramilla or Nason should die first.
Night pressed down on Camelot with a hard cold, driven by sharp winds. Here and there a glow of light spilling from an upper window spoke of people still awake. But most shutters were drawn, and a thin sliver of moon low in the sky only seemed to emphasize the darkness. Even the snow-coating rooftops and piled along the fronts of buildings, where it had escaped the day's traffic, was a shadowy gray. The lone man, muffled head to ankles in a dark cloak, striding through the frozen slush left on the paving stones, answered to David Hanlon or Doylan Millar with equal ease. A name was no more than a coat, and a man changed his coat whenever needed. He had worn a number over the years. Given his wishes, he would have had his feet up in front of a roaring fire in the royal palace, a mug in his hand, a pitcher of brandy at his side, and a willing wench on his knee. But he had others' wishes to serve. At least the footing was better here in the new city. Not good, with this frozen muck underfoot that could turn a careless step into a sprawl. Yet a man's boots were less likely to go out from under him here than back on the steeper hills of the inner city. Besides, darkness suited him tonight. There had been few people in the streets when he started out, and the number had dwindled away as darkness deepened. Wise people stayed indoors once night fell. Occasionally, dim shapes skulked in the deeper shadows, but after a brief study of Hanlon, they scuttled around corners ahead of him, or withdrew into alleys trying to muffle their curses as they floundered in snow that likely had not been touched by the sun. He was not bulky, and little taller than the average run of men, with his sword and breastplate hidden by his cloak to boot. But footpads looked for weakness of hesitation, and he moved with an obvious self-confidence, plainly unafraid of lurkers, an attitude helped by the long dagger concealed in his gauntleted right hand. He kept an eye out for patrols of guardsmen as he walked, but he did not expect to see any. The strong arms and prowlers would have sought other hunting grounds if the guards were about. Of course, he could send nosy guardsmen on their way with a word, yet he wanted no observers of any kind, and no questions why he was so far from the palace afoot. His step hesitated as two heavily cloaked women appeared at a crossing well ahead, but they moved on without glancing his way, and he breathed more easily. Very few women would venture out at this time of night without a man along to wield sword or cudgel, and even without seeing their faces, he would have wagered a fistful of gold to a horse apple. That pair were Aes Sedai. Or else some of those strange women who filled most of the beds in the palace. The thought of that lot brought a scowl, and a prickling between his shoulder blades like the brush of nettles. Whatever was going on in the palace, it was enough to give him the grips. The sea folk women were bad enough, and not just because they went swaying along the halls in that seductive way, then pulled a knife on a man. He had not even thought of patting one on the bottom after he realized they and the Aes Sedai were staring at one another like strange cats in a box. And plainly, however impossibly, the sea folk were the larger cats. The others were worse, in a way. No matter what the rumors said, he knew the look of Aes Sedai, and it did not include wrinkles. Yet some of them could channel, and yet the disturbing notion that they all could, which made no sense at all. Maybe the sea folk had some sort of peculiar dispensation, But as for these kin, as Vader called them, everyone knew that if three women who could channel and were not Aes Sedai sat down at the same table, Aes Sedai would appear before they could finish a pitcher of wine and tell them to move on and never speak to one another again. And make sure they did it, besides. That was given. But there those women sat in the palace, over 100 of them, holding their private meetings, walking around Aes Sedai without one frown between them. Until today, anyway. And whatever had set them huddling like frightened hens, the Aes Sedai had been every bit as anxious. There were too many oddities to suit him. When Aes Sedai behaved oddly, it was time for a man to look to the safety of his own skin. With a curse, he jerked himself out of his reverie. A man needed to look out for his skin in the night, too. Letting his concentration drift was no way to do it. At least he had not stopped or even slowed. After a few more steps, he smiled a thin smile and thumbed the blade of his dagger. The wind sighed down the street and fell, whistled across rooftops and fell, and in the brief silences between, he could hear the faint crunch of the boots that had been following him since shortly after he left the palace. At the next crossing street, he turned to his right at the same steady, unhurried pace, then suddenly flattened his back against the front of a stable that stood hard on the corner. The wide stable doors were shut and likely barred on the inside, but the smell of horse and horse dung hung in the icy air. The inn across the street was closed up tight as well, its windows shuttered and dark, the only sound aside from the wind, the creak of its swinging sign he could not make out in the night. No one to see what they should not. He had a moment's warning. The sound of boots quickened in an effort not to let him out of sight too long. And then a cowled head was thrust cautiously around the corner. Not cautiously enough, of course. His left hand darted into the cowl to seize a throat at the same time his right made a practiced stop thrust with a dagger. He half expected to find a breastplate or a mail shirt under the man's coat, and he was ready if he did. But an inch of steel sank easily beneath the fellow's breastbone. He did not know why that seemed to paralyze a man's lungs, so he could not cry out until he had drowned in his own blood. But he knew that it did. Still, tonight he had no time to wait. No guards inside at present did not mean matters would stay that way for long. With a quick wrench, he slammed the man's head against the stable's stone wall hard enough to crack his skull, then shoved his dagger to the hilt, feeling the blade grate as it dug through the fellow's spine. His breathing remained steady. Killing was just a thing that had to be done now and again, nothing to get excited over. But he hurriedly lowered the corpse to the snow against the wall and crouched beside it, wiping his blade on the dead man's dark coat, while sticking his other hand into his armpit to tug off his steel-backed gauntlet. Head swiveling, he watched the street both ways as he felt quickly across the man's face in the darkness. A rasp of stubble under his fingers told him that it was a man, but no more. Man, woman, or child made no difference to him. Fools behaved as though children had no eyes to see or tongues to tell what they saw. Yet he wished there had been a mustache or a bulbous nose. Anything to spark a memory and tell him who this fellow had been. A squeeze at the dead man's sleeve found thick wool, neither fine nor particularly rough, and a sinewy arm that could have belonged to clerk or wagon driver or footman. To any man, in short, just like the coat. Searching down the body, he rifled through the fellow's pockets, finding a wooden comb and a ball of twine, which he tossed aside. At the man's belt, his hand paused. A leather sheath hung there, empty. No man on earth could have drawn a dagger after Hanlon's blade found his lungs. Of course, there was good cause for a man to carry his knife unsheathed when he walked out at night, but the reason that came most readily to mind right then was to stab someone in the back or cut a throat. It was only a fleeting pause, though. Wasting no time on speculation, he sliced off the fellow's purse beneath the drawstrings. The weight of the coins he spilled into his hand and hastily stuffed into his own pocket told him there was no gold, likely not even a piece of silver. But a cut purse and no coins would make whoever found the body think him the prey of strong arms. Straightening, he tugged on his gauntlet, and only moments after driving his blade home, he was striding along the slush-covered pavement once more, dagger held close to his side beneath his cloak and eyes wary. He did not relax until he was a street away from the dead man, and then he did not relax very far. Most people who heard of the killing would accept the tale of murder for theft that he had laid out for them, but not whoever had sent the fellow. Following all the way from the palace meant that he had been sent, but by whom? He was fairly sure that any of the sea folk who wanted a knife put in him would have done the deed herself. For all that the kin troubled him just by being there, they seemed to keep quiet and walk small. True, people who practiced avoiding notice were the most likely to resort to a hired knife in the night, but he had never exchanged more than 3 words at a time with any of them, and he certainly had never tried to finger one. The Aes Sedai seemed more likely, yet he was sure he had done nothing to rouse their suspicions. Still, any one of them might have her own reasons for wanting him dead. You could never tell with Aes Sedai. Birgitte Trahilian was a silly bint who seemed to think she really was a character out of a story, maybe even the real Birgitte, if there had ever been a real Birgitte, but she could well think he was a threat to her position. She might be a strumpet, wiggling around the corridors in those trousers the way she did, yet she had a cold eye. That one could order a throat slit without blinking. The last possibility was the one that worried him most, though. His own masters were not the most trusting of people, and not always the most trustworthy. And the Lady Cheyenne Avarhin, who currently gave him his orders, was the one who had sent a summons that had pulled him into the night, where a fellow just happened to be waiting to follow him, knife in hand. He did not believe in coincidence, no matter what people said about this Althor. Thoughts of turning back to the palace came and went in a flash. He had gold tucked away. He could bribe his way through the gates as easily as anyone else, or just order one opened long enough to let him ride out. But it would mean spending the rest of his life watching his back, and anyone who came inside arm's length of him might be the one sent to kill him. Not so different from the way he lived now, except for the certainty that someone would put poison in his cup or a knife through his ribs sooner or later. Besides, that stone-eyed troll Birgitte was the most likely culprit, or an Aes Sedai. Or maybe he had offended these kin somehow. Still, it always paid to be careful. His fingers flexed around the dagger's hilt. Life was good at the moment, with plenty of comfort and plenty of women impressed or frightened into compliance by a captain of the guards. But life on the run was always preferable to death here and now. Finding the correct street, much less the correct house, was not easy. One narrow side street looked very like another when darkness swathed both. But he took a care and eventually found himself pounding on the front doors of a tall, shadowed pile that could have belonged to a wealthy but discreet merchant. Except he knew now that it did not. Avarhin was a tiny house, extinct, some said, but one daughter of it remained, and Cheyenne possessed money. One of the doors swung open, and he flung up a hand against the sudden glare of light. His left hand, the dagger in his right, he kept concealed and ready. Squinting through his spread fingers, he recognized the woman at the door, in the plain dark dress of a maid. Not that that eased his mind by a hair. "Give us a kiss, Phalion," he said as he stepped inside. Leering, he reached for her, left-handed, of course. The long-faced woman brushed his hand aside and shut the door firmly behind him. "Cheyenne is closeted with a visitor in the front sitting room upstairs," she said calmly, "and the cook is in her bedchamber. There is no one else in the house. Hang your cloak on the rack. I will let her know you are here, but you may have to wait." Alan let his leer vanish and his hand drop. For all of her ageless face, handsome was the best that Phalion could be called. And even that might be stretching the truth, with her cold gaze and a cold manner in the bargain. She was hardly the sort of woman he would have chosen to fondle, but it seemed she was being punished by one of the chosen, and he was supposed to be part of the punishment, which altered matters. To some extent. Tumbling a woman who had no choice had never troubled him, and Phalion certainly had none. Her maid's dress was simple truth. She did the work of 4 or 5 women by herself, maids and scullions and spit girl, sleeping when she could, and truckling whenever Cheyenne frowned. Her hands were rough and red from doing laundry and scrubbing floors. Yet she was likely to survive her punishment, and the last thing he wanted was an Aes Sedai with a personal grudge against David Hanlon. Not when circumstances might well change before he had an opportunity to put a knife through her heart, anyway. Reaching an accommodation with her had been easy, though. She seemed to have a practical view. When others could see, he rumpled her every time she came in reach, and when there was time, he bundled her up to her tiny maid's room under the eaves, where they mussed the bedclothes, then sat on the narrow bed in the cold and exchanged information. Though at her urging, he did give her a few bruises, just in case Cheyenne chose to check. He hoped she remembered that it was at her urging. "Where are the others?" he said, swinging his cloak off and hanging it on the leopard-carved cloak rack. The sound of his boots on the floor tiles bounced from the entry hall's high ceiling. It was a fine space, with painted plaster cornices and several rich wall hangings on carved panels that were polished to a faint glow, well lit by mirrored stand lamps with enough gilding for the royal palace itself. But burn him if it was much warmer than outside. Phalion raised an eyebrow at the dagger in his hand, and he sheathed it with a tight smile. He could have it out again faster than anyone would believe, and his sword near as fast. The streets are full of thieves at night. Despite the chill, he removed his gauntlets and tucked them behind his sword belt. Anything else might make it appear he thought himself in danger. The breastplate should be enough anyway, come the worst. I do not know where Marilyn is, she said over her shoulder, already turning away and gathering her skirts for the stair-steps. She went out before sunset. Marilyn is in the stables with his pipe. We can talk after I inform Cheyenne you've arrived. Watching her climb the stairs, he grunted. Marilyn, a hulking fellow Hanlon did not like at his back, was banished to the stables behind the house whenever he wanted to smoke his pipe, because Cheyenne disliked the smell of the rough tobacco he used. And since he usually took a pot of ale with him, or even a pitcher, he should not be coming in any time soon. Marilyn worried him more. She was Aes Sedai too, apparently as much under Cheyenne's orders as Phalion, or himself. But he had no agreements with her. No arguments either, yet he distrusted any Aes Sedai on principle, Black Aja or not. Where had she gone? To do what? What a man did not know could kill him, and Marilyn Gimolfin spent entirely too much time off doing things he knew nothing about. He was coming to the conclusion that there were entirely too many things in Caemlyn he knew nothing about. Past time he learned, if he wanted to live. With Phalion gone, he went from the icy entry hall straight to the kitchen at the back of the house. The brick-walled room was empty, of course. The cook knew better than to poke her nose out of her room in the basement, once she was sent away for the night. And the black iron stove and the ovens stood cold, but a small blaze in the long stone hearth made the kitchen one of the few rooms in the house that would be warm. Compared to the rest, at least. Cheyenne was a stingy woman, except when it came to her own comforts. The fire here was only in case she happened to want mulled wine in the night, or a heated egg milk. He had been in this house above half a dozen times since coming to Caemlyn, and he knew which cabinets held the spices and which room off the kitchen always held a cask of wine. Always good wine. Cheyenne never stinted there, not with that she intended to drink herself anyway. By the time Phalion returned, he had the honey pot and a dish of ginger and cloves sitting on the wide kitchen table with a pitcher full of wine and a poker thrust into the fire. Cheyenne might say, "Come now," and mean now, but when she wanted a man to wait, it could be near daylight before she saw him. These calls always cost him sleep. Burn the woman. "Who is the visitor?" he asked. He gave no name. "Not to me," Phalion said, propping the door to the hall open with a chair. That let some of the sparse warmth leak out, but she would want to be able to hear if Cheyenne summoned her. Or maybe she wanted to make sure the other woman was not able to eavesdrop. A lean man, tall and hard, with the look of a soldier. An officer of some rank, maybe a noble by his manner, an Andoran by his accents. He seems intelligent and cautious. His clothes are quite plain, though costly, and he wears no rings or pins. Frowning at the table, she turned to one of the tall open-front cabinets beside the door to the hallway and added a second pewter cup to the one he had set out for himself. It had never occurred to him to set out two. Bad enough he had to fix his own wine. Aes Sedai or no Aes Sedai, she was the maid. But she took a chair at the table and pushed the dish of spices away from her, for all the world as though she expected him to serve. Cheyenne had two visitors yesterday, however, more careless than this fellow, she went on. One, in the morning, had the golden boars of Sarand on the cuff of his gauntlets. He probably thought no one would notice small work, if he thought at all. A plump, yellow-haired man in his middle years, who looked down his nose at everything, complimented the wine as though surprised to find a decent vintage in the house, and wanted Cheyenne to have me beaten for showing insufficient respect. She said even that in a cold, measured voice. The only time she had had any heat in her was when Cheyenne put the strap to her. He had heard her howl right enough then. A countryman who has seldom been to Camelin, but believes he knows how his betters behave, I should say. You can mark him by a wart on his chin and a small half-moon scar beside his left eye. The fellow in the afternoon was short and dark, with a sharp nose and wary eyes, and no scars or marks I could see, though he wore a ring with a square garnet on his left hand. He was sparing with words, very mindful to give away nothing in the little I heard, but he carried a dagger with the 4 moons of House Marn on the pommel. Folding his arms, Hanlon leaned against the side of the fireplace and kept his face smooth despite a desire to scowl. He had been sure that the plan was for Elaine to take the throne, though what came after remained a mystery. She had been promised to him as a queen. Whether or not she wore a crown when he took her mattered not a whit to him, except for the spice it added. Breaking that long-legged bit to saddle would be pure pleasure if she had been a farmer's daughter, especially after the chit cut a slice off him today in front of all those other women. But dealings with Sarand and Marn said maybe Elaine was meant to die uncrowned. Maybe, in spite of all the promises that he could romp a queen, he had been placed where he was, so he could kill her at some selected moment, when her death would bring some specific result sought by Cheyenne. Or rather, by the chosen who had given her her orders. Moradin, the fellow was called, a name Hanlon had never heard before coming to this house. That did not trouble him. If a man had the nerve to call himself one of the chosen, Hanlon was not fool enough to question it. The likelihood that he was no more than a dagger in this did not trouble him. So long as a dagger did the job, what matter if it broke in the doing? Much better to be the fist on the hilt than the blade. "Did you see any gold change hands?" he asked. "Did you hear anything?" "I would have said," she replied thinly. "And by our agreement, it is my turn for a question." He managed to mask his irritation behind an expectant look. The fool woman always asked about the Aes Sedai in the palace, or those she called the kin, or about the sea folk. Silly questions. Who was friendly with whom, and who unfriendly? Who exchanged private words, and who avoided one another? What he had heard them say, as if he had nothing to do with his time but lurk around the hallways spying on them. He never lied to her. There was too much chance she might learn the truth, even mired here in this house as a maid. She was Aes Sedai, after all. But it was growing difficult to come up with something he had not already told her, and she was adamant that he'd give information if he expected to receive any. Still, he had a few tidbits to offer today, some of the sea folk going off, and the whole lot of them jumping for most of the day as if they had icicles shoved down their backs. She would have to settle for that. What he needed to know was important, not bloody gossip. Before she could get her question out, though, the door to the outside opened. Morellon was large enough that he almost filled the doorway, yet icy cold still swirled in, a gust that made the small fire dance and sent sparks flying up the chimney until the big man pushed the door shut. He gave no sign that he felt the chill, but then his brown coat looked thick as 2 cloaks. Besides, the man was not only the size of an ox, he had the wits of one. Setting a tall wooden mug down on the table with a thump, he tucked his thumbs behind his wide belt and eyed Hanlon resentfully. "You messing with my woman?" he muttered. Hanlon gave a start. Not from any fear of Morellon, not with the oaf on the other side of the table. What startled him was the Aes Sedai leaping from her chair and snatching up the wine pitcher. Dumping in the ginger and cloves, she added a scoop of honey and swirled the pitcher around as if that was going to mix everything, then used a fold of her skirt to pull the poker from the fire and shove it into the wine without checking to see whether it was hot enough yet. She never looked in Morellon's direction at all. "Your woman?" Hanlon said carefully. That earned a smirk from the other man. "Near enough. The lady figured I might as well use what you aren't. Anyway, Valley and me keep each other warm nights." Morellon started around the table, still grinning, but at the woman now. A shout echoed in the hallway, and he stopped with a sigh, his grin fading. "Billian!" Cheyenne's distant voice called sharply. "Bring Helen up now and be quick about it." Billian set the pitcher on the table hard enough to stop wine to them, and was heading for the door before Cheyenne finished. When the other woman spoke, Billian jumped. Hanlon jumped too, for a different reason. Catching up to her, he seized her arm as she took the first step on the stairs. A quick glance back showed the kitchen door closed. Maybe Morellon did feel the cold. He kept his voice low anyway. What was that all about? It's none of your business, she said curtly. Can you get me something that will make him sleep? Something I can put in his ale or wine? He will drink anything, however it tastes. If Cheyenne thinks I'm disobeying orders, it bloody well is my business. And you ought to see it that way, too, if you have two bloody thoughts to rub together. She tilted her head, staring down that long nose at him, cold as a fish. This has nothing to do with you. As far as Cheyenne is concerned, I will still belong to you when you are here. You see, certain matters changed. Suddenly, something unseen grasped his wrist tightly and pulled his hand from her sleeve. Something else latched onto his throat, squeezing till he could not draw breath. Futilely, he scrabbled left-handed for his dagger. Her tone remained cool. I thought certain other matters should change accordingly. But Cheyenne does not see things logically. She says that when the great Master Moradin wishes my punishment lessened, he will say so. Moradin gave me to her. Morellon is her way of making sure I understand that. Her way of making sure I know that I am her dog, until she says otherwise. Abruptly, she drew a deep breath, and the pressure vanished from his wrist and throat. Air had never tasted so sweet. You can get what I ask for, she said, as calm as if she had not just tried to kill him with the bloody power. Just the thought that that had been touching him made his skin crawl. I can't, he began hoarsely, and stopped to swallow, rubbing at his throat. It felt as though it had been cinched in a hangman's noose. I can get you something that will put him in a sleep he'll never wake from. As soon as it was safe, he was going to gutter like a goose. She snorted derisively. I would be the first Cheyenne suspected, and I might as well cut my own wrist as object to anything she decided to do. It will be enough if he sleeps the nights through. Leave the thinking to me, and we will both be the better for it. Resting a hand on the carved newel post, she glanced up the stairs. Come. When she says now, she means now. A pity he could not hang her up like a goose to wait for the night. Following her, his boots bumped on the treads, sending a clatter through the entry hall, and it struck him that he had not heard the visitor leave. Unless the house had some secret way out he did not know, there was only the front door, the one in the kitchen, and a second at the back that could only be reached by passing the kitchen. So it seemed he was to meet this soldier. Maybe it was supposed to come as a surprise. Surreptitiously, he eased his dagger in its sheath. As expected, the front sitting room had a fine blaze burning away in the wide fireplace of blue-veined marble. It was a room worth the looting, with seafolk porcelain vases on the gilt-edged side tables, and tapestries and carpets that would fetch a pretty price. Except that one of the carpets was likely worthless now. A low blanket-covered mound lay near the middle of the room, and if the fellow that made it had not stained the carpet with his blood, Hanlon would eat the boots sticking out from one end. Cheyenne herself was sitting in a carved armchair, a pretty woman, in gold-embroidered blue silk, with an ornate belt of woven gold, and a heavy gold necklace around her slim neck. Glossy brown hair hung below her shoulders, even caught in a net of intricate lace. She looked delicate at first glance, but there was something vulpine about her face, and her smile never touched those big brown eyes. She was using a lace-edged handkerchief to clean a small dagger capped with a fire drop on the pommel. Go tell Morellon that I will have a bundle for him to dispose of later, Phalion, she said calmly. Phalion's face remained smooth as polished marble, but she made a curtsy that lacked little of cringing before she scuttled out of the room at a run. Watching the woman and her dagger from the corner of his eye, Hanlon moved to the covered mound and bent to lift a corner of the blanket. Glazed blue eyes stared out of a face that might have been hard alive. The dead always looked softer. Apparently, he had been neither as cautious nor as intelligent as Phalion thought him. Hanlon let the blanket fall and straightened. He said something you objected to, my lady? He said mildly. Who was he? He said several things I objected to. She held her dagger up, studying the small blade to be sure it was clean, then slid it into a gold-worked sheath at her waist. Tell me, is Elaine's child yours? I don't know who fathered the whelp, he said wryly. Why, my lady? Do you think I'd go soft? The last chit who claimed I'd gotten a child on her, I stuffed her down a well to cool her head and made sure she stayed there. There were a long-necked silver wine pitcher and 2 chased silver cups sitting on a tray on one of the side tables. Is this safe? He asked, peering into the cups. Both had wine in the bottom, but a little addition to one would have turned the dead man into easy prey. Cottrell Mosnin, an ironmonger's daughter from Mayron, the woman said, just as smoothly as if it were common knowledge, and he very nearly flinched in surprise. You split her head open with a rock before you pitched her down, no doubt to spare her drowning. How did she know the wench's name, much less about the rock? He had not remembered her name himself. No, I doubt you would go soft, but I would hate to think you were kissing the Lady Elaine without letting me know. I would purely hate that. Suddenly, she frowned at the blood-stained handkerchief in her hand and rose gracefully to glide to the fireplace and face the flames. She stood there, warming herself, never even glancing in his direction. Can you arrange for some of the Shonchan women to escape? Best if it can be both those called Suldam and the ones called Damani. She stumbled a little over the strange words. But if you can't do both, then a few of the Suldam should do. They will free some of the others. Maybe. Blood and bloody ashes. She was dancing from one thing to another worse than Phalian tonight. It won't be easy, my lady. They're all guarded close. I didn't ask whether it would be easy, she said, staring into the flames. Can you shift guards away from the food warehouses? It would please me if some of those actually burned. I am tired of attempts that always fail. That I cannot do, he muttered. Not unless you expect me to go into hiding right after. They keep a record of orders that would make a Karianan wince. And it wouldn't do any good anyway. Now with those bloody gateways bringing in more wagons every bloody day. In truth, he was not sorry for that. Queasy over the means used, certainly, but not sorry. He expected the palace would be the last place in Camelin to go hungry in any case, but he had lived out sieges on both sides of the lines, and he had no intention of ever boiling his boots for soup again. Cheyenne wanted fires, though. Another answer I did not ask for. She shook her head, still looking into the fireplace, not at him. Perhaps something can be done there. How close are you to actually enjoying Elaine's affections? She finished grimly. Closer than the day I arrived in the palace, he growled, glowering at her back. He tried never to offend those the Chosen had set above him, but the chit was trying him. He could snap that slender neck like a twig. To keep his hands from her throat, he filled one of the cups and held it with no intention of drinking. In his left hand, of course. Just because there was one dead man in the room already, did not mean she had no plans to make it 2 corpses. But I have to go slow. Back her into a corner and tickle her out of her shift. I suppose not, Cheyenne said in a muffled voice. She is hardly the sort of woman you are used to. Was she laughing? Was she amused at him? It was all he could do not to throw down the wine cup and strangle the fox-faced bint. Suddenly she turned around, and he blinked as she casually slipped her dagger back into its sheath. He had never seen her draw the bloody thing. He took a swallow of wine without thinking, and almost choked when he realized what he had done. How would you like to see Camelin looted? She asked. Well enough, if I have a good company at my back and a clear path to the gates. The wine had to be safe. 2 cups meant she had drunk too. And if he had picked up the dead man's, there could not be enough poison left in it to sicken a mouse. Is that what you want? I follow orders as well as the next man. He did when he seemed likely to survive them, or when they came from the Chosen. As well die for a fool as disobey the Chosen. But sometimes it helps to know more than go there and do that. If you told me what you're after here in Camelin, I might be able to help you reach it faster. Of course. She smiled a toothy smile, while her eyes stayed as flat as brown stones. But first, tell me why there is fresh blood on your gauntlet. He smiled back. A footpad who got unlucky, milady. Maybe she had sent the man, and maybe not. But he added her throat to the list of those he intended to slit. And he might as well add Marilyn Gamalthin, too. After all, a lone survivor was the only one who could tell the tale of what had happened.
Chapter 16. The subject of negotiations. The morning sun sat on the horizon, leaving the nearer side of Tar Valon still wrapped in shadows, but the snow that covered everything gleamed brightly. The city itself seemed to shine behind its long white walls, all bravely towered and bannered, yet to Egwene, sitting her roan gelding on the riverbank above the city, it seemed even farther away than it really was. The Aranin widened to more than 2 miles here, and the Alandrella Aranin and Osandrella Aranin flowing to either side of the island were almost half that, so that Tar Valon appeared to sit in the middle of a great lake, unreachable despite the massive bridges that stood high above the waters so that ships could sail beneath them easily. The White Tower itself, a thick bone-white shaft rising to an impossible height from the city's heart, filled her own heart with a yearning for home. Not for the 2 rivers, but for the tower. That was her home now. A plume of smoke caught her eye, a faint black line rising from the far bank beyond the city, and she grimaced. Daishar stamped a hoof in the snow, but a pat on the neck sufficed to soothe the roan. It would take more to soothe his rider. Homesickness was the smallest part of it, minuscule compared to the rest. With a sigh, she rested her reins on the high pommel of her saddle and raised the long brass-bound looking-glass. Her cloak fell back, slipping off one shoulder, but she ignored the cold that misted her breath and placed a gloved hand to shield the front lens against the sun's glare. The city walls leapt closer in her sight. She focused on the tall, curving arms of North Harbor that pushed out into the upstream currents. People moved purposefully atop the battlements that enfolded the harbor, but she could barely discern men from women at that distance. Still, she was glad that she was not wearing her 7-striped stole, and that her face was deep within her cowl, just in case someone there had a stronger glass than she. The wide mouth of the man-made harbor was blocked by a massive iron chain, drawn taut a few feet above the water. Tiny dots on the water, diving birds fishing in front of the harbor, gave the chain scale. One single pace-long link would have required 2 men to lift it. A rowboat might slip under that barrier, but no vessel of any size would enter unless the White Tower allowed. Of course, the chain was only intended to keep out enemies. "There they are, Mother," Lord Gareth murmured, and she lowered the glass. Her general was a stocky man in a plain breastplate worn over a plain brown coat, without any touch of gilt or embroidery anywhere. His face was bluff and weathered behind the bars of his helmet, and the years had given him a strange sort of comforting calmness. All you need do was look at Gareth Bryn to know that if the pit of doom opened in front of him, he would smother his fear and go about doing what needed doing, and other men would follow him. He had proved on battlefield after battlefield that following him was the path to victory. A good man to have following her. Her eyes followed his gauntleted hand pointing upriver. Just coming in sight around a point of land, 7 river ships were slicing furrows down the Aranin. Large vessels, as such things were seen on the river, one with 3 masts. Their triangular sails stood out tight, and their long sweeps cut hard through the blue-green water to add a little more speed. Everything about the craft spoke of a burning desire for speed, a desire to reach Tar Valon now. The river was deep enough here that ships could run within shouting distance of the banks in places, but these sailed in almost single file as close to the middle of the Aranin as the steersman could manage and hold the wind. Sailors clinging to the mastheads kept watch along the shoreline, and not for mudbanks. In fact, they had nothing at all to fear so long as they kept out of bowshot. True, from where she sat her horse, she could have set fire to every one of those ships, or simply cut holes through their hulls and let them sink, the work of moments. Yet doing so surely meant some of those aboard would drown. The currents were strong, the water like ice, and the swim to shore long, for those who actually could swim. Even one death would make what she did, using the power as a weapon. She was trying to live as though already bound by the 3 oaths, and the oaths protected those vessels from her or any other sister. A sister who had sworn on the oath rod would not be able to make herself set those weaves, perhaps not even to form them, unless she could convince herself she was in immediate danger from the ships. But neither captains nor crews believed that, apparently. As the river ships came closer, shouts thinned to threadbare by distance drifted across the water. The lookouts up on the masts pointed to her and Gareth, and it quickly became apparent they took her for an Aes Sedai with her warder. Or at least the captains were unwilling to take the chance she was not. After a moment the beat of the sweeps increased. Only by a fraction, but the oarsmen labored to find that fraction. A woman on the quarterdeck of the lead vessel, likely the captain, waved her arms as if demanding still more effort, and a handful of men began running up and down the deck, tightening this line or loosening that to change the angle of the sails, though Egwene could not see that they achieved anything. There were men on those decks other than sailors, and most of those crowded to the railings, a handful raising looking-glasses of their own. Some seemed to be measuring the distance left to cover before they reached the safety of the harbor. She thought about weaving a flare, a starburst of light, perhaps with a loud bang, just above each of the vessels. That would certainly let anyone aboard with brains realize that neither speed nor distance kept them safe here, only a forbearance born of the 3 oaths. They should know that they were safe because of Aes Sedai. Exhaling heavily, she shook her head and mentally upbraided herself. That simple weave would also attract attention in the city, certainly more than the appearance of a single sister. Sisters often came to the riverbank to stare at Tar Valon and the tower. Even if the only reaction to her flares was some sort of counter-display, once begun, that sort of contest could be very difficult to put a stop to. Once begun, matters might well escalate out of hand. There were too many opportunities for that, as it was, the more so these last 5 days. The harbor master hasn't let above 8 or 9 ships in at one time since we arrived, Gareth said as the first vessel drew abreast of them. But the captain seemed to have worked out the timing. Another clutch will appear soon and reach the city about the time the tower guards are sure these fellows actually came to enlist. Jimar Chubane knows enough to guard against me sneaking men in aboard ships. He has more of the guards crowded into the harbors than anywhere except at the bridge towers, and not many anywhere else so far as I can learn. That will change, though. The flow of ships starts at first light and keeps up till near nightfall. Here and at South Harbor, too. This lot doesn't seem to be carrying as many soldiers as most do. Every plan is brilliant until the day comes, Mother. But then you must adapt to circumstances or be ridden down. Egwene made a vexed sound. There must be 200 or more passengers altogether on those 7 ships. A few might be merchants or traders, or some other sort of innocent traveler, but the low sun glittered off helmets and breastplates and steel discs sewn to leather jerkins. How many shiploads arrived each day? Whatever the number, a steady flow was pouring into the city to enlist under High Captain Chubane. Why do men always rush so hard to kill or be killed? She muttered irritably. Lord Gareth looked at her calmly. He sat his horse, a big bay gelding with a white stripe down his nose, like a statue. Sometimes she thought she knew one small part of how Swan felt about the man. Sometimes she thought it would be worth whatever effort was needed to startle him just to see him startled. Unfortunately, she knew the answer to her own question as well as he did. at least as it applied to men going soldiering. Oh, there were men enough who rushed to support a cause or defend what they thought was right, and some who sought adventure, whatever they believed that was. Yet the simple fact was that for carrying a pike or spear, a man could earn twice each day what he would get for walking behind another man's plow, and half again as much if he could ride well enough to join the cavalry. Crossbowmen and archers fell in between. The man who worked for another could dream of having his own farm or shop one day, or beginning toward one that his sons could build on. But he surely had heard 1,000 tales of men soldiering for 5 years or 10, and coming home with enough gold to set themselves up in comfort. Tales of ordinary men who rose to become generals or lords. For a poor man, Gareth had said bluntly, staring down the point of a pike could be a better view than the hind end of somebody else's plow horse, even if he was far more likely to die from the pike than earn fame or fortune. A bitter way to look at it, yet she imagined that was how most of those men on the ships saw matters too. But then, that was how she had gotten her own army. For every man who wanted to see the usurper pulled from the Amerlin seat, for every man who even knew for certain who Elida was, 10, if not 100, had joined for the pay. Some of the men on the ship were raising their hands to show the guards on the harbor walls they were not holding weapons. No, she said, and Lord Gareth sighed. His voice remained calm, but his words were hardly comforting when he spoke. Mother, so long as the harbors remain open, Tar Valon will eat better than we do, and rather than growing weaker with hunger, the Tower Guard will grow larger and stronger. I very much doubt that Elida will let Chubane rush out to attack us, as much as I wish he would. Every day you wait only adds to the butcher's bill we'll have to pay sooner or later. I've said from the start it will come to an assault in the end, and that hasn't changed, but everything else has. Have the sisters put me and my men inside the walls now, and I can take Tar Valon. It won't be clean, it never is, but I can take the city for you, and fewer will die than if you delay. A knot formed in her belly, twisted tight till she could hardly breathe. Carefully, step by step, she performed novice exercises to make it loosen. The bank contained the river, guiding without controlling. Calm settled on her, in her. Too many people had begun seeing the uses of gateways, and in a way, Gareth represented the worst. His business was war, and he was very good at it. As soon as he learned a gateway could take more than a small group of people at one time, he had seen the implications. Even the great walls of Tar Valon, beyond the range of any siege catapult not on a barge, and worked with the power till the largest catapult could not mark them in any case, might as well be made of paper against an army that could travel. But whether Gareth Bryn had learned or not, other men would seize on that idea. The Ashaman already had, it seemed. War had always been ugly, yet it was going to grow uglier. No, she repeated. I know people are going to die before this is over. The light helped her she could see them dying just by closing her eyes. Even more would die if she made the wrong decisions, though, and not just here. But I have to keep the White Tower alive against Tarman Gaiden, to stand between the world and the Ashaman. And the tower will die if this comes to sisters killing one another in the streets of Tar Valon. That had already happened once. It could not be allowed a second time. If the White Tower dies, hope dies. I shouldn't have to tell you that again. Daishar snorted and tossed his head, lunging as though he had sensed her irritation. But she reined him in firmly and slipped the looking-glass into the tooled leather case hanging from her saddle. The diving birds gave up their fishing and sprang into the air as the thick chain that blocked North Harbor began to droop. It would dip beneath the surface well before the first ship reached the harbor mouth. How long ago had it been that she reached Tar Valon by that same route? Almost beyond memory, it seemed. An age gone. It had been another woman who came ashore and was met by the mistress of novices. Gareth shook his head with a quick grimace. But then he never gave up, did he? You have to keep the White Tower alive, Mother, but my job is to give it to you. Unless things have changed that I don't know about. I can see sisters whispering and looking over their shoulders, even if I don't know what it means. If you still want the tower, it will come to an assault. Better soon than late. Suddenly the morning seemed darker, as though clouds had obscured the sun. Whatever she did, the dead were going to pile up like cordwood. But she had to keep the White Tower alive. She had to. When there were no good choices, you had to choose the one that seemed least wrong. I've seen enough here, she said quietly. With one last glance at that narrow line of smoke beyond the city, she turned Daishar toward the trees 100 paces back from the river, where her escort waited among the evergreen leatherleaf and winter-bare beech and birch. 200 light cavalry in boiled leather breastplates or coats covered with metal discs would certainly have attracted notice appearing on the riverbank. But Gareth had convinced her of the necessity of these men, with their slender lances and short horsebows. Without any doubt, that smoke plume on the far bank rose from burning wagons or supplies. Pinpricks. Yet those pinpricks came every night. Sometimes one, sometimes 2 or 3, till everyone looked for smoke first thing on rising. Hunting the raiders down had proved impossible so far. Sudden snow squalls flared around the pursuers, or fierce freezing night winds, or the tracks simply vanished abruptly, the snow beyond the last hoofprint as smooth as fresh fallen. The residues of weavings made it plain enough they were being aided by Aes Sedai, and there was no point in taking a chance that Elida had men and maybe sisters on this side of the river too. Few things could please Elida more than getting her hands on Egwene Alvir. They were not her whole escort, of course. Besides Shiriam, her keeper, she had ridden out with 6 more Aes Sedai this morning, and those who had warders had brought them. So behind the sister, 8 men waited in color-shifting cloaks that rippled in queasy-making fashion when a breeze caught them, and otherwise made parts of riders and horses seem to vanish into the tree trunks. Aware of the dangers, from raiders at least, aware that their Aes Sedai were wound tight to near breaking, they watched the surrounding copse as though the cavalrymen were not there. The safety of their own Aes Sedai was their primary concern, and that they trusted to no one else. Saren, a black-bearded stump of a man, not that short but very wide, stayed so close to Nisau that he seemed to lean over the diminutive yellow. And Jory managed to loom over Morvrin as well, though he was actually shorter than she. As broad as Saren, but very short, even for a Kyrianan. Mirel's 3 warders, the 3 she dared acknowledge, clustered around her until she could not have moved her horse without pushing one of theirs out of her way. Anaya's Setagana, lean and dark and as beautiful as she was plain, almost managed to surround her by himself. And Tervail, with his bold nose and scarred face, did the same with Bayanin. Carlinia had no warder, not unusual for a white, but she studied the men from the depths of her fur-lined cowl as if thinking about finding one. Not too long ago, Egwene would have hesitated to be seen with those 6 women. They and Shiriam had all sworn fealty to her for various reasons, and neither they nor she wanted the fact known or even suspected. They had been her way to influence events to the extent that she could, when everyone thought her no more than a figurehead. A girl Amerlin the hall of the tower could use as it wished, and no one listened to. The hall had lost that illusion when she brought them to declare war on Elida, finally admitting what they had been about since the day they had fled the tower in the first place. But that only made the hall and the Ajas worry over what she would do next, and try to figure out how to make sure that whatever it was met with their approval. The sitters had been very surprised when she accepted their suggestion of a council, 1 sister from each Aja, to advise her with their wisdom and experience. Or perhaps they thought her success with the declaration of war had gone to her head. Of course, she had just told Morvrin and Anaya and the others to make sure they were the sisters chosen, and they retained enough prestige within their Ajas to manage it. Just. She had been listening to their advice, if not always taking it, for weeks by that time. But now there was no longer any need to arrange furtive meetings or pass messages in secret. It seemed, however, that there had been an addition to the party while Egwene was staring at the tower. Shiriam, wearing the narrow blue stole of her office outside her cloak, managed a very formal bow from her saddle. The flame-haired woman could be incredibly formal at times. "Mother, the sitter Dallana wishes to speak with you," she said, as if Egwene could not see the stout gray sister sitting there on a dappled mare almost as dark as Shiriam's black-footed mount. "On a matter of some importance, so she says." And the slight touch of asperity meant Dallana had not told her what matter. Shiriam would not have liked that. She could be very jealous of her position. "In private, if you please, Mother," Dallana said, pushing back her dark hood to reveal hair nearly the color of silver. Her voice was deep for a woman's, but it hardly carried the urgency of someone with important matters to speak of. Her presence was something of a surprise. Dallana often supported Egwene in the hall of the tower when sitters were quibbling over whether a particular decision actually concerned the war against Elida. That meant the hall was required to support Egwene's commands as if they had stood with the greater consensus. And even the sitters who had stood for war did not half like that little fact, which made for endless quibbling. They wanted to pull Elida down, yet left to themselves the hall would have done nothing but argue. Truth to tell, though, Dallana's support was not always welcome. One day she could be the very image of a gray negotiator seeking consensus, and the next so strident in her arguments that every sitter within hearing got her back up. She had been known to set the cat among the pigeons in other ways, too. No fewer than 3 times now, she had demanded the hall make a formal declaration that Elida was Black Aja, which inevitably led to an awkward silence until someone called for the sitting to be adjourned. Few were willing to discuss the Black Aja openly. Dallana would discuss anything, from how they were to find proper clothes for 987 novices, to whether Elida had secret supporters among the sisters, another topic that gave most sisters a case of the prickles. Which left the question of why she had ridden out so early and by herself. She had never approached Egwene before without another sitter or 3 for company. Dallana's pale blue eyes gave away no more than did her smooth Aes Sedai face. "While we ride," Egwene told her. "We will want a little privacy," she added when Shiriam opened her mouth. "Stay back with the others, please." The keeper's green eyes tightened in what might almost have been anger. An efficient keeper, and eager with it, she had pinned her hopes on Egwene and made little secret that she disliked being excluded from any meeting Egwene had. Upset or not, she bowed her head in acceptance with only a small hesitation. Shiriam had not always known which of them commanded, but she did now. The land tended upward from the river Aranon, not in hills, but simply rising toward the monstrous peak that loomed to the west, so massive it seemed to mock the name mountain. Dragon Mount would have towered above everything else, even in the spine of the world. In the relatively flat country around Tar Valon, its white-capped crest seemed to reach the heavens, especially when a thin thread of smoke was streaming away from the jagged top as it was now. A thin thread at that height would be something else entirely close at hand. Trees gave out less than halfway up Dragon Mount, and no one had ever succeeded in reaching the crest or even coming close, though it was said the slopes were littered with the bones of those who had tried. Why anyone would try in the first place, no one could quite explain. Sometimes the long evening shadow of the mountain stretched all the way to the city. People who lived in the region were accustomed to Dragon Mount dominating the sky, much as they were accustomed to the White Tower looming above the city walls and visible for miles. Both were unchanging fixtures that had always been there and always would be, but crops and crafts occupied the people's lives, not mountains or Aes Sedai. In tiny hamlets of 10 or a dozen stone houses roofed in thatch or slate, and the occasional village of 100, Children playing in the snow or carrying buckets of water from the wells stopped to gape at the soldiers riding along the dirt tracks that passed for roads when not covered in snow. They carried no banners, but a few of the soldiers wore the flame of Tarvalon worked on their cloaks or coat sleeves, and the warders' strange cloaks named at least some of the women as Aes Sedai. Even this near the city, sisters had been an uncommon sight till recently, and they were still something to make a child's eyes gleam. But then the soldiers themselves probably came close in the list of marvels. The farms that fed Tarvalon covered most of the land, stone-walled fields surrounding sprawling houses and tall barns of stone or brick, with copses and coppices and thickets of trees between, and groups of farm children often ran a little distance parallel to the line of travel, leaping across the snow like hares. Winter chores kept most older folk indoors, but those who ventured out, heavily bundled against the cold, spared barely a glance for soldiers or warders or Aes Sedai. Spring would be coming soon, and the plowing and planting, and what Aes Sedai did would not affect that. The light willing, it would not. There was no point to guards unless they rode as if expecting an attack, and Lord Gareth had arranged a strong party of foreriders and lines of flankers, with trailers riding to the rear, while he led the mass of the soldiers right behind the warders, who followed closely on the heels of Shiriam and the council. They all made a large, lopsided ring around Egwene, and she could almost imagine she was riding through the countryside alone with Delana, if she did not look around too closely, or if she looked beyond. Instead of pressing the gray sitter to speak, it was a long ride back to camp, and no one was allowed to weave a gateway where the weave might be observed. There was plenty of time to hear what Delana had to say. Egwene compared the farms they passed to those in the two rivers. Perhaps the realization that the two rivers was no longer home made her study them. Acknowledging the truth could never be a betrayal, yet she needed to remember the two rivers. You could forget who you were if you forgot where you came from, and sometimes the innkeeper's daughter from Emmond's Field seemed a stranger to her. Any of these farms would have looked decidedly odd set down near Emmond's Field, though she could not put a finger on why exactly. A different shape to the houses, a different slant to the roofs, and more often slate topped a house than thatch here, when you could make out either through the snow that was often mounded on the rooftops. Of course, there was less thatch and more stone and brick in the two rivers now than there had been. She had seen it in Tel Riad. Change came so slowly you never noticed it creeping up on you, or far too fast for comfort, but it came. Nothing stayed the same, even when you thought it did, or hoped it would. Some think you're going to bond him your warder, Delana said suddenly in a quiet voice. She might have been engaging in casual conversation. Her whole attention seemed to be on arranging the hood of her cloak with green-gloved hands. She rode well, blending with the motion of her mare so effortlessly that she appeared unaware of the animal. Some think perhaps you already have. I haven't had one myself for some time, but just knowing your warder is there can be a comfort, if you choose the right one. Egwene raised an eyebrow. She was proud that she did not gape at the woman. This was the very last topic she would have expected. And Delana added, Lord Gareth. He spends a great deal of time with you. He's rather older than is usual, but Greens often choose a more experienced man for their first. I know you never actually had an Aja, yet I often think of you as a Green. I wonder, will Swan be relieved if you bond him, or upset? Sometimes I think one, sometimes the other. Their relationship, if it can be called that, is most peculiar, yet she seems completely unembarrassed. You must ask Swan herself about that. Egwene's smile had some bite in it. So did her tone, for that matter. She did not entirely understand herself why Gareth Bryn had offered her his loyalty, but the hall of the tower had better uses for its time than gossiping like village women. You can tell whoever you choose that I've bonded no one, Delana. Lord Gareth spends time with me, as you put it, because I am the Amerlin and he is my general. You may remind them of that as well. So Dallana thought of her as a green. That was the Ajah she would have chosen, though in truth she wanted only one warder. But Gawain was either inside Tar Valon or else on his way to Camelin, and either way she would not lay hands on him soon. She patted Daishar's neck unnecessarily, and tried to keep her smile from becoming a glare. It had been pleasant to forget the hall, among other things, for a while. The hall made her understand why Swan had so often looked like a bear with a sore tooth when she was Amerlin. I wouldn't say it has become a matter for wide discussion, Dallana murmured, so far. Still, there is some interest in whether you will bond a warder and who. I doubt that Gareth Bryn would be considered a wise pick. She twisted in her saddle to look behind them. At Lord Gareth, Egwene thought. But when the sitter turned back around, she said very softly, Shiriam was never your choice for keeper, of course. But you must know that the Ajahs set the rest of that lot to watch you as well. Her dappled gray mare was shorter than Daishar, so she had to look up at Egwene, which she tried to do without seeming to. Those watery blue eyes were suddenly quite sharp. There was some thought that Swan might be advising you too well after the way you brought about the declaration of war against Elida. But she's still resentful over her changed circumstances, isn't she? Shiriam is seen as the most likely culprit now. In any case, the Ajahs want a little warning if you decide to pull another surprise. I thank you for the warning, Egwene said politely. Culprit? She had proven to the hall that she would not be their puppet, yet most insisted on thinking she had to be someone's. At least no one suspected the truth about her counsel. It was to be hoped no one did. There is another reason you should be wary, Dallana went on, the intensity in her eyes belying the casualness of her voice. This was more important to her than she wanted Egwene to know. You may be sure that any advice one of them gives you comes straight from the head of her Ajah. And as you know, the head of an Ajah and its sitters don't always see eye to eye. Listening too closely could put you at odds with the Hall. Not every decision concerns the war, remember, but you will surely want some of those to go your way. An Amerlin should listen to every side before making any decision, Egwene replied. But I'll remember your warning when they advise me, daughter. Did Dallana think she was a fool? Or perhaps the woman was trying to make her angry. Anger made for hasty decisions and rash words that sometimes were hard to take back. She could not imagine what Dallana was...
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call it into this live for tonight. Well, I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.